This is PT World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali, and you are watching Fault Lines. 11 weeks of war. It is yet far from over. 14,200 people killed, including 3,280 civilians. 11 million people displaced. But still, there is no end in the line of sight. Perhaps Russia had not anticipated such a stiff resistance from the Ukrainian side. Economically, the worries for Russia have also increased amid all the economic sanctions being put against Russia by the West. More important is the fact that the role of American military and perhaps American intelligence has increased painstakingly. According to Washington Post and New York Times, two reputable magazines, not only US's intelligence was involved on 14th April 2022's sink of Moscow, but also for the alleged death of 12 Russian generals fighting in the front. Also important is the fact that these are the largest refugee crises since the Second World War, and the entire version of stories coming from the West are against the Russian side of the story. So as to start this program, I have someone in the panel of my guest who will give me the Russian perspective. I am joined by Leonid Sevin. He is author, analyst, and a strategic expert joining me from Moscow. Leonid Sevin, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Leonid, the first thing that we are going to discuss today is about the problems that Russia is facing. The war is not over as was expected. Back in 2014, Russia's attack on Ukraine lasted very short. But this time, the pain has increased. It's 10 weeks gone and still no end in the line of sight. How do you see these developments?
First of all, it's incorrect formulas about 2014 because Russia not attacked Ukraine at this time. This time started coup organized by the West in February exactly, and then started civil war in the south of Ukraine. Then it was a referendum in Crimea, and people of this peninsula would like to join Russia. So when Russia started special operation this year, nobody thought about the final date of this operation. So I think it's a mistake to tell that Russia interested to finish this campaign in few weeks or 1 month, just before May Day, for example. So there was announced that the goal of operation, first goal is demilitarization of Ukraine, because it became like existential threat to Russia, and the second is denazification of Ukraine, and both processes are going on just now. When it will be finished, nobody knows. I think Mr. Putin also don't know, or Mr. Shoigu, defense minister of Russia. And of course, I also cannot give you forecasting when it will be finished, especially because the West continuing to promote anti-Russian propaganda and provide some weapon system to Ukraine.
Mr. Sevin, thank you very much for the correction that you made, because most of the stories that reach us come from the western side of the story. But will you not agree with me on the fact that the resistance put forward by Ukraine was far from the expectations from the Russian side by all means?
Yes, there was problem with Russian logistics during the first weeks of operation. Then it was changed military command for Ukrainian operation. And now we see another type of operation art of Russian military in Ukraine. It's based on the concept of separation of different lines, and we see that there is still some neo-Nazi groups blocked in some regions of the south of Ukraine, and Russia continues strikes on logistic infrastructure of Ukraine in central part and western part, including the stocks of weapons that provided by the West. So it's changed from point of view of operational art.
Mr. Sevin, there is a lot of news coming from the West that Russia is under immense economic pressure under the sanctions as posted by United States, There are sanctions on the Russian trade. There are sanctions on Russian currency, and countries are not allowed to trade. But despite the fact, as we were discussing before the program, ruble has gone back to the pre-war time, which is just ununderstandable. So help us to understand why Russian ruble is not showing the signs of weakness, despite all the pressure being put by all the West together.
We see real effectiveness of Russian government, how they react on the sanctions. Sanctions very serious, and no any state in history not faced this such kind of sanctions, because we have not SWIFT transaction from bank operation, for example. Not all banks, but most of Russian banks. Also, Russian CS cannot go to ports of foreign country in Western Europe. I mean, there are also some limits for aircraft, etc. But first of all, we imposed counter sanctions, and Western companies and states suffering now. We see the serious inflation in the United States, rise of the price for gasoline, for example, and fantastic rise of the price for natural gas in Europe, and for food sector also the same. So second is, I think it's also very important effect. It's that natural gas now sold by Russian currency, not by euro or American dollars. And the third is not well on the West, is that now Russia implemented double counter economics for Russian state activity. It means that external activity and domestic activity will be a little bit separated, and the Russian currency ruble will be more linked with the gold reserves of Russia inside. So I think it's very effective, and actually it was experienced during the Soviet time, so it's not new. And of course, the neutral countries will see that Russian economics under the time of sanctions very effective, and maybe this experience will be useful in other countries too, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin American countries.
But Mr. Seven, you will agree with me on the fact that if war continues, it will continue to bleed Russian economy. War is an expensive business. It doesn't come for free. And perhaps, apparently, as it looks from here, it's a part of Americans' ploy to keep Russia engaged in Ukraine for a long time. We saw that happening to USSR in Afghanistan. And if that happens to be the case, if United States and NATO are successful in keeping Russia engaged in war for another couple of years, the cost of war will increase astronomically for Russia. Will you agree with me on that?
Partially, because war also works for economics. Economics also works for war. In military history and in world history, you see that United States and have benefits from many wars. In Korea, for example, and in the same in Iraq and Afghanistan, etc. The main problem I see that we are more separated from world economics, but Russia is very resilient. Russia have autarky system because we have everything what we need for our existence. We have natural reserves, we have our science, industry sector, and now our state provides special grants and zero taxes for some sectors like IT. It is just one example. So it's a question about confrontation between different types of world visions. From Russian side, based on sovereignty, on national interest, and from other side on the kind of Western-centric and to become more honest, American-centric system. So it's confrontation between not Ukraine and Russia. It's continuation confrontation between West and Russia.
Mr. Seven, there are some news on international media about the health of President Putin. It is said that he's suffering from cancer and Parkinson, and many in the West believe these news are not accurate. Perhaps these are the signs of growing differences within Russian polity. So update us on the health of President Putin and his well-being.
I heard such kind of fake stories for last 15 years about Putin's health, etc. So I just recommend not to believe kind of this yellow press, and just you can to compare how health Russian president and the personal health of, for example, American presidents or other world leaders, and just to compare who is in better condition. And of course, we will see that Putin is much better conditions. So my recommendation is just to use and good source of information. For Russia, a lot of official websites, and you can do information from them.
Thank you very much, Leonid Savin, for being my guest in the program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Leonid Savin from Moscow, and he was telling us that the news about the health issues of Russian president are false. He also said that the Russian economy is not as affected as informed by the Western media. He's also insistent of the fact that Russia is very well planned towards Ukraine, and whatever is happening is the situation, the political situation and the military situation is in control for Russia. My second guest in today's program is joining me from United Kingdom. He's Mr. James Carey, Roosevelt Scholar from Magdalene College, about to join me in a while. And it's very important to hear the story from both the sides, because what happens most of the time on international media is that we are only getting one side of the story. So since we have heard from Russia, let's hear from Mr. James Carey. As I said earlier, he is joining us from Cambridge University, Roosevelt Scholar. Mr. Carey, I welcome you to my program.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Barry.
And since we discussed last time, there are many other developments that have happened. One of the major developments is that, according to the American media, papers as reputable as Washington Post and New York Times are now claiming the role of US's intelligence in sinking a Russian ship and in killing in the deaths of Russian generals. So don't you think that the role for United States has stretched for too long in this war?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think it reflects what is going on now, which is not necessarily that the US's strategy has changed, but that its notification to the world around that strategy, its ability to be able to voice that strategy, seems to have changed quite significantly since Joe Biden's Secretary of State went to Ukraine. It seems now that the US is more able, or feeling more able, to be able to suggest to the world that its intelligence is being used in such a diverse way. And that does indeed suggest that the US is crossing a strategic line here. Where that strategic line is something of debate, but it suggests now that we are seeing a different period of the war as we enter into May. And that, I think, is being reflected not just in the way that US military intelligence is being used to sink the Moskva, as you asked, but also now in the death of US generals, as you alluded to, but also the targeting of different structures inside Russia as well. This seems to suggest that there has been a strategic engagement and elevation from the US that's reflected in what Ukrainian military has been able to do very recently, and that's quite an interesting development now.
Mr. Carey, will you agree with me on the fact that the United States wants to keep Russia engaged and to make this war longer? Because so far it's been 10 or 11 weeks of war, and we have not seen any major achievement, any major accomplishment by Russia. Don't you think that it is the replication of a strategy that United States pursued against USSR in Afghanistan, that is to kill Russia by 1,000 fools?
I think that's a relatively astute reading of the situation, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that at all. It does seem that the US is working to prolong the war in a number of different ways, and also elevate the amounts of targets that Ukraine has been able to target, especially on the battlefields in the east. It seems very much that the US is willing to engage in quite a significant amount of intelligence gathering and dissemination to different Ukrainian forces in the east. One thing that I will say is that it seems, though, that this has always been the case. It seems that right from the beginning of the war, there's been a strategic value placed by the US on keeping Ukraine engaged and also being able to furnish the Ukrainians with the types of military armaments that would allow deeper engagement for longer. So the NLAW system and the Javelin system are both shoulder-mounted engagement systems that can engage heavy machinery that the Russians have rolled into Ukraine, and that all suggests that they're trying to break down supply chains. They're trying to break down individual categories of the Russians' ability to engage in battlefield warfare. That, however, suggests that what Russia can do to engage more thoroughly is actually step up the engagement, and that is something that the US is seemingly starting to anticipate. With their ability to voice, as we spoke about just before, their ability to voice the fact that they are engaged in providing intelligence to Ukraine. That speaks to a really interesting increase in the level of military engagement that we will see throughout May, and probably suggests that there will be an escalation before a de-escalation, and perhaps, hopefully, a diplomatic solution.
And there is some more land annexed by Russia. Certainly, Russia has made inroads within Ukraine. Some more land is under their territorial control now. Do you anticipate Russia to leave this land, go back to Ukrainian people at some point in time? Because if Russia keeps its hold and possession on the land so occupied, it will be in violation of many of the resolutions of the United Nations.
Yeah, that's a really good question as well, and we're starting to see actually some engagement towards this question by President Zelensky of Ukraine, who has suggested that the red lines that he's considering for a diplomatic solution are the return of Russian forces to where they were on February the 23rd, the day before the engagement, the day before their invasion. Now, that suggests, rather interestingly, for the first time, that President Zelensky is willing to cede Crimea to the Russians, which is the first time that we've heard Ukraine suggest this in any way. Now, whether that moving back to the land that the Russians occupied on the 23rd of February suggests that they would still contest Crimea, but through different methods, is something we can discuss. But for the first time, we're starting to see the landscape shifting towards potential solutions. It would be unlikely, I think, that Russia would be able to maintain all of the territory that they've been able to take over these first 10, 11 weeks of the war. But there might indeed be pockets where it becomes impractical or an impractical solution to remove Russians entirely from those regions. However, that seems to suggest as well that we are starting to get towards political solutions to these problems instead of what we saw previously, even a couple of weeks ago when we last spoke, a really resolute, hard line, we will never cede any territory. And I think that probably speaks to where we currently are in the war, which is, to what you alluded to earlier, a bit of a stalemate. So there are interesting things to come in the next several weeks for that.
Ukrainian Foreign Minister, his second name is Klube, has requested once again to the international community and has said that if there are not bans on the oil import from Russia, this war will not end. All the money he believes that Russia is making out of its trade with the West are helping Russia to kill more Ukrainians. On the other side, there's a global economy that is taking the brunt of this war. What do you think will happen next? Can EU afford to step out of the trade ties with Russia entirely?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the EU has put together a package of what becomes a Russian embargo. an embargo on all Russian imports into the EU, and that of course includes oil and gas. Now that was roundly rejected by specifically Hungarian President, the Hungarian and Czech Republic governments. But that has actually been addressed by the EU, which suggests that they are very much focused on getting this package through the 27 member states, and actually suggesting to Viktor Orban that, yes, we need this to occur. And so what they've been doing in the last couple of days is putting an extra year, an extra 18 months onto that time limit for Viktor Orban to be able to remove Hungary from those oil and gas connections to Russia. But to your actual question there, whether the EU can afford to remove all Russian imports and exports is another question entirely, and it does speak to this really rather pronounced effort by the West to remove all trading ties with Russia, to effectively isolate them from doing business in the West. Whether that's practical or practically possible is unlikely, given the amount of workarounds that are available to especially large international companies with embargoes. So to your question there, I don't believe that to be entirely possible totally, but might well be the case by July that we do see this embargo come into place.
And Mr. Kerry, as you don't see it entirely possible, there are some signs of fractures within the European Union's bond as well. We discussed it in the previous program while we were discussing about the stance of France and Germany being slightly different than the rest of European Union. And this week we have the statement from Hungarian Prime Minister as well, who's not going to back, he said explicitly, the bans on the Russian oil. So if there are differences within the European Union, this means this might not go long, and European Union will stand divided. What's your thought on it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Again, the European Union, the way that the European Union's voting systems work, for any of your viewers not perfectly up to scratch with it, is that all 27 member states need to agree. And what that usually means is that you either talk some countries up to a solution or talk some countries down to a solution. And in this case, with Slovakia, Hungary, and the Czech Republic being quite against this idea of banning all Russian oil and gas, what we will probably see is a fair amount of leeway given to those three states, so that the other 24 or 23 or 22, depending upon where some other European Union member states see themselves, will be to give them extra time and some leeway of engaging in import-export with Russia over an extended period of time. That will give the European Union the leeway that it needs to be able to say to Russia, well, actually, we will be starting to ban Russian oil and gas from Germany, from Italy. And that will start to have a very large impact upon the Russian economy. And the EU's belief is that that will enable them to be able to put enough pressure, exert enough pressure onto Putin to bring him to a negotiation table with the West.
And do you believe that Russian polity will keep standing behind the Russian president for all this that has happened? Because the cost of the war perhaps has gone way too far than Russia had anticipated.
Well, this is one of the really interesting things to watch for on May 9, because May 9 for Russia is Victory Day, and it's a very important day of celebration for Russia's victory over during World War II, and has taken on a larger symbolic meaning in Russia for for a celebration of its existence. And so, one thing to watch for on May 9 for all of the viewers here is to watch for how Putin is received, have a look at who is around President Putin as well, who is giving hand to Vladimir Putin. This all becomes really important signals for what is going on internally in the Kremlin, because at the moment there's very little evidence to suggest that there is any deliberate move to remove Putin from power or to lessen his grip on power. And so in the short term, I don't believe we should anticipate any movement on Putin's leadership. And in fact, it may be that May 9 is used as a day to really force through and capitalize upon the Russian people's popularity, pardon, Putin's popularity with the Russian people, and really capitalize upon that to announce things like a summer offensive in Ukraine, because it could very well be that that's what we're gearing up towards now.
Thank you very much, James Carey, for being my guest in the program.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break and we'll join back with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to add more into the context of this program, as we have so far covered a point of view from Russia and a point of view from an independent scholar from Cambridge University. I'm now inviting Mr. Kail Inan. He is senior geopolitical expert based in Istanbul, joining me from Istanbul on Skype. I welcome you to my program.
Thank you, Ali. Happy to be here.
First things first, so we're discussing this war between Russia and Ukraine. Most of the people in West, most of the press in West, most of the polities in West believe that Russia is the one to be held responsible for this war. But there was a very interesting statement by Pope Francis, who recently has declared that NATO is the one that has to be held responsible for provoking Moscow to attack on Ukraine. What are your thoughts on it?
Pope Francis, His Holiness, actually had a virtual call with the Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch Kirill. They had over the virtual call. They discussed, how Patriarch Kirill shouldn't be influencing or dominating the political influence there. And Pope, I think it was in his words, he said he shouldn't transform he shouldn't transform himself into an altar boy for President Putin, and he should be more careful into influencing the regional leaders of the society in Moscow there. So I think that points out to how the war is being influenced in Russia, Ali.
Mr. Inan, there are also expectations that Russia, that is not clearly on the winning side in this war against Ukraine, might just declare an all-out war, something that Russia has not done so far. And there are anticipations that if this happens, Russian president will be able to garner more support and push some more military, extend his military muscle a bit more towards Ukraine. Do you think it to be a plausible thing to happen in the near future?
What we should look at here is that President Putin is expected to send a warning to the West when he is going to lead a celebration on May 9th, so that's in 2 days. And he's going to mark the 77th Soviet Union's victory over NATO, which is actually quite coincidental because it's also marking the 76th day of the military incursion of Russia into Ukraine. Right now, the Russian forces continue their ground assault in the Azovstal steel plant with continued support to be complete control over the Black Sea region. So one might think that region, Azovstal region, as a checkpoint for the Black Sea. So it is really important that Ukrainian forces stand there with the NATO allies. In Kharkiv and Kherson regions, which are different from one another, which are kind of separate from one another, but Russia actually started changing local signs and the names of cities there to spread their growing influence, both spiritually and their military.
There was some lag in your voice, so I could hardly understand what you just said. Let's jump to the next thing. And this is the propaganda war. So you agree with me on the fact that the propaganda and the use of media plays a very important role in setting up the international discourse. And in this case, Russia, that primarily speaks Russian, has all of its media in Russian, does not have its point of view actively presented in the international landscape. And that is extending an immense opportunity to the entire West, and particularly United States, to do a propaganda in favor of what United States believes to be the right thing. So do you agree that Russia is lagging far behind in the space of international media and is not able to garner diplomatic support from other countries because of not being able to put its point of view forth to the international audience?
I definitely say that's the case, Ali, because Russian state-sponsored media is censoring many things, especially within the context of the war, ongoing war. Russia is censoring a lot of the regions like Kharkiv and Kherson. They're controlling internet space there, and Russia is quite hell-bent on making people think that they are the winning side all the time. Plus, to the counter side, Russia is actually trying to prove itself that it is, has justified reasons for its military incursion, but the Western community is far away from believing that that is the case. So wherever it uses its internet dominance, sphere of internet, again, Russia becomes the minority in controlling the internet airspace there.
And doesn't it work the other way around as well? Because the people living within Russia, they're not fluent in English, they don't understand English. All they can see is RT or many other Russian channels, and they just hear the Russian side of the story. That can so perhaps both the sides are playing for their audience.
Indeed, I mean, how does a democracy if one state is speaking of democracy so much, is influencing people's thoughts, beliefs in a way that is singular in opinion and its trajectory. So it's not really welcoming that people only see one side of the story instead of seeing it with whole facts and basis on what is happening on the ground. And people, try to find alternative ways of trying to get more solid information, or at least they try to understand what the Russian party is actually purporting the truth that they speak it out to be, but actually that isn't the case, Ali.
But you agree with me on the fact that many other international problems, many other international conflicts stay unreported or underreported on the Western media, and perhaps the conflict of Ukraine and Russia have taken far more attention.
Sure. Let's quickly look at Iran. Iran was the center of global attention for many years, many previous years. Right now, it has lost that as a strategic position at its center of influence in the international media, and which is taking away its regional influence, strategic influence, because that you're able to influence Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and some other countries in the region. So that is down playing or having the after effects of what we're seeing, the international media focusing its tectonic plates into the Russian propaganda there. Plus, we're seeing North Korea launching ballistic missiles into the Japan Sea, which you might have heard, or our viewers might have heard, which I think is constituting a great threat in the Eastern Pacific. And I think North Korea has a lot of something sinister, if that is, if I'm not underplaying it, so to speak, Ali.
Thank you very much, Gail Anand, for being guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Gail Anand from Istanbul, and he had a very different point of view. He believes that both the sides, the Russian and the West, are playing for their domestic audience, keeping them engaged by extending them the point of view or the narrative that they want their audience to digest. To join me in the last segment or the last part of my program is Miss Alice Hickson. She is an expert working on refugees and displacement issues. She has recently published an article for Newsline Institute as well, wherein she has written at length about the issue of the refugees that are going out from Ukraine to Europe. I have invited her to be a part of my program. Ms. Alice Hickson, I welcome you to my program.
Yeah, thank you, Shabahat, for having me here on Fault Lines.
Ms. Hexen, the exodus of refugees that you have just mentioned in your article is increasing. There are more people leaving Ukraine and going to the European Union. Please tell me more about the issue of the refugees that you have just written about.
Yeah, that's right. As of now, more than 11 million people, which is 1/4 of Ukraine's population, have currently fled their homes due to Russia's invasion. So whether that's becoming refugees abroad or being internally displaced inside the country, these are record levels of displacement. To put it into context, we haven't really seen this pace or scale since World War II, and just within 2 months, these numbers are comparable to those of Syria's decade-long civil war, which has displaced more than 13 million. So while there's been an outpouring of support for Ukraine's refugees fleeing abroad, especially from the EU, the situation of IDPs stuck inside the country is quite dire. Especially in cities like Mariupol, which are under siege, many civilians are still waiting to be evacuated through humanitarian corridors.
And you have also written about the fact that the humanitarian corridors established by Russia are not dependable. You said these are unreliable transit points. Why do you believe these to be unreliable transit points? Do you believe that there are any threats to the people utilizing or using these humanitarian corridors?
Humanitarian corridors, which are temporary demilitarized zones, are intended to allow the safe passage of humanitarian aid in and refugees out of crisis. So civilians who are trapped in besieged cities like Mariupol, these are critical lifelines for them. And they've been stuck without food, water, and electricity and are really relying on these humanitarian corridors to get out. But unfortunately, their evacuations have been delayed because these transit points are unreliable due to Russian troops firing upon these agreed upon humanitarian corridors that are meant to be kind of like truce areas where there is no firing. So there's also been incidents where the International Red Cross has kind of been forced to turn back after failed attempts to evacuate Ukrainians, which is definitely very disappointing for Ukrainian civilians who are thinking that they are going to get out of these areas and then only to just turn back around and go back in. So even though evacuations have begun this week, hundreds of civilians are still trapped there. And another issue with civilians trying to leave war-torn cities in Ukraine is that they have been reports of discrimination and violence by Ukrainian forces towards third-party nationals. So people from Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia have said that, they've experienced being turned away at train stations that have had trains
Alice, will you agree with me on the fact that Europe have dealt all the immigrants from Central Asia differently, or perhaps from the Middle East differently than the way they have dealt with the refugees coming from Ukraine? Do you believe that there is a discrimination in the Europe's policy when it comes to deal with the immigrants?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, since the Russian invasion, there has definitely been this outpouring of support, and Ukrainians have received a very warm welcome. There's definitely been a pan-European response. They've been kind of quickly granted the access to stay and work. The EU actually even invoked a legal mechanism for the first time, a 2001 Temporary Protection Directive, which has given refugees the chance to stay and work for up to 3 years. They get to put their children in schools automatically without all of the delays and bureaucracy of the normal asylum procedure. So that's been a very generous and wonderful response, but we can't help but notice that this comes in harsh contrast to their response to previous migration crises from Asia, Africa, the Middle East. So the most clear example is in 2015, the migrant crisis, and also just last August when Afghans were arriving, when the Taliban was taking over Afghanistan. The EU's rhetoric then was definitely focused more on keeping refugees outside the region rather than extending EU protections to them. So, and after the increase of flows following the Syrian civil war in 2015, the EU really spent a lot of time and energy investing in Frontex, which is its border agency. So there was a lot of investment in that, securing their external border, introducing new border policies and counterterrorism measures, which has led to increased violence and ethnic profiling of migrants. So unlike these refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukrainians have been placed almost on a fast track for unemployment, and governments have been waiving visa requirements and providing almost instant access to labor markets and education.
And Alice, also the fact that the impact of these refugees, the economic impact that these refugees will bring, has also been painted in a very positive manner, as if this is a blessing happening to Europe. So as an expert, do you actually believe this to be a positive development for Europe, the diaspora coming from Ukraine to Europe?
Yes, the EU member states' labor markets, especially for countries that face declining birth rates, high emigration into Western Europe, and experience labor shortages, like Lithuania, for example, the influx of Ukrainians is really seen as a good thing, and it's almost a temporary solution to that labor shortage problem. Thousands of jobs have been offered exclusively to Ukrainian refugees by on-the-ground recruitment agencies and through a vast network of online job boards that's kind of just sprung up across social media. So this form of outreach is happening with a speed and scope that is pretty rare for the European Union. And Ukraine has a lot to offer. They have a very skilled workforce. I think more than 70% of workers hold some sort of secondary or higher education degree. So once refugees are further integrated, there will likely be very positive impacts on the labor.
But Alice, all of these people might not just be going to Europe. Many might be just going to Russia. Are there any people going towards Russia as well?
That's right. So for a while, that was sort of limited and growing evidence that Ukrainian civilians were being forced to relocate to parts of Russia and Russia-controlled areas. And statements from Mariupol City Council, echoed by then statements by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and then just concerns from eyewitnesses who did escape Mariupol, all kind of reported that there was these forced deportations occurring. And the reports all mentioned that Russian forces were forcibly deporting locals, confiscating their Ukrainian passports, and sending them through so-called filtration camps, and then onto remote areas in Russia. And so all of these instances were all reported and had yet to be confirmed by news sources. But just on Thursday, the top human rights official at the United Nations told the Security Council that her staff has documented scores of cases of Russian forces targeting male civilians around Kyiv. And some were beaten, detained, executed, and some had been taken to detention camps inside Russia and Belarus. So now these reports are confirmed. And there have been...
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alice Hickson, for being guest in my program. And ladies and gentlemen, this was my last guest, Ms. Alice Hickson from Newsline Institute, Washington, D.C. What we conclude from this program is that the problem is far from over. The refugees' crisis are going further, and the people that are going to Europe might not just come back very soon, because Ukraine, after the war, will take a lot of time in its rebuild, and peace building is certainly a time-taking process. We'll join you tomorrow again with another program, and until then, Allah Hafiz.